Before we begin, since this is a BBC-owned property, I feel the need to point out that the news arm of the BBC has a continuing issue with transphobic leanings in its news coverage. You can find in a pinned comment below various videos from both myself and other YouTubers covering this issue. And while I understand that the Doctor Who creative team is not responsible for this, I will continue to point this out for as long as it remains a consistent issue. Thank you. Well, before we tag in the next era, how about an overview? So yes, it's true. Chibnall's era is over. But now that it is finally done, I think it's worth taking a look back and trying to sort my feelings on it overall, because it's been a heck of a ride. We had Series 11, which I very much wanted to like. Structurally, it was doing a lot of things I wanted. It was focusing on more self-contained stories. It wasn't doing a big mystery box thing. It wasn't loading it with a ton of old villains. It wasn't banking as much on nostalgia. It was trying to be a newer thing. It also didn't work especially well for me for a lot of the episodes. Series 12, I mostly liked quite a bit better, as it then proceeded to bring in a whole bunch of stuff that is old and nostalgic and reintroduced a mystery box with the Timeless Child, which, mystery boxes, I should do a dedicated video on my thoughts on those in Doctor Who specifically at one point. But, we move forward until we actually got to what the Timeless Child was, and I hated that idea. I hated that concept. And then we got to Flux, which seemed deeply compromised by COVID at best and did not really properly follow up on what had been done in Series 12. Then we had the closing specials. Eve of the Daleks. I liked that one. But then we had Legend of the Sea Devils, which I enjoyed well enough, but it's the epitome of disposable. I never need to see it again. And I was surprised how much I like Power of the Doctor. But again, it didn't actually seem to deal with a lot of what came before. There's a whole bunch of stuff that, for me to just examine and look at, feels like it was brought up, possibly even set up to do more stuff with later, and then it just didn't. Now, I had my initial interpretation as to why this was, but now I have my different interpretation of why this was. So, my initial interpretation of why this was based off just looking at the works themselves. Because looking at Series 11, Series 12, the very severe changes from no multi-parters, barely anything even close to an overarching story, self-contained stuff, no old characters, to a whole bunch of old stuff, a mystery box, and massively shaking up canon in a way that only has meaning if you are an older fan, and most of them didn't like it, to this supposedly completely serialized story that also kind of wasn't and felt like it was trying to do 10 things in a space built for maybe 5. Something that disjointed, to me, my normal interpretation of that would be, this is something that, if it ever knew what it wanted to be, it kept changing and didn't have the confidence in itself. If I didn't know better, and that is an if, because I do now know better, and we'll get to that, but if I didn't know better, my interpretation of this, regardless of how much you like any or all of these series, they shift and change the way this gets approached so fundamentally. Every single series under Chibnall's run, the read I would have had is maybe there was a plan initially, but it kept getting changed because of other stuff. Now, in the case of Flux, we know there were some changes that happened flatly because of COVID. That affected the way it could be shot. It affected how many episodes they could shoot. But in the case of, say, the transition from Series 11 to Series 12, that felt very much like, oh, we tried something, but the response wasn't quite what we liked. Let's now do all the stuff that we didn't do last time. It felt reactive. It felt a response to the reception. Chibnall himself, at least, claims that's not the case. Now, if you just want to flatly not believe him, I suppose you can do that. Given that he doesn't have the job anymore, I'm not sure what incentive he would have to lie. While he was still potentially going to do more series, there would theoretically be some incentive for him to paint his feelings about his work so far in the best light possible, because he doesn't want to buckle confidence in his ability to do things. And if he's kind of like, oh, people didn't like what we did, I'm sorry, we'll do better, that just seems like an artist with no self-confidence whatsoever. And I don't think he would do that. But now, well, I say now, back in April is specifically where I'm pulling as a main source from this. He gave an interview with Doctor Who magazine. Now, remember, in April, all the stuff involving him was shot. It was done. Some of it wouldn't air until a while later, but he was done at that point. It was all over for him. So again, he had no incentive to lie or to sugarcoat things. And he even admitted to a few failings. Now, unfortunately, I'm getting pretty much all this secondhand because Doctor Who magazine, you have to pay to get it. And I'm frankly in a little bit of a financial crunch right now. There's my Patreon. I'll plug that early if you want. Any help is good. But, you know, I don't have the money to just throw at it just to double check what I was seeing elsewhere. Now, I did go to multiple sources in terms of places and blogs and YouTubers, etc., who synopsized what he said, and some even pulled what appeared to be direct quotes. And it was consistent enough that I don't think any of these people were twisting his words. They were just presenting as much from the interview as they could that wouldn't amount to copyright infringement by just flat out reposting the thing. So based off that interview, my interpretation of Chibnall just running around like a chicken with his head cut off and not knowing what he wanted, or maybe initially knowing what he wanted, but then panicking at the response and trying to do something else and going for a completely different feel, and then not even really sticking with that because he doesn't pick up the plot points of things like The Fugitive Doctor, like The Timeless Child, in anything more than tiny conciliatory ways, and then gives us a finale that doesn't really touch back on hardly any of this stuff other than to just kind of acknowledge that, okay, yes, that existed. It feels undisciplined. It feels like somebody should be going, yeah, I really didn't have a handle on this. It kind of went out of my control. What Chibnall said in that article, and like some, as I said, some YouTubers already reported on this way back when it came out, but now I want to talk about it in the context of his era actually being over. He expressed not a lot of regret. He said he felt he was leaving the position of showrunner with no unfinished business, which was the main thing that I would assume he had, because again, The Timeless Child feels like it didn't go anywhere. Like, we had this massive reveal that is a complete and utter shakeup of so much of what we know about the Doctor's history, about the Doctor as a person, and about Gallifreyan history in general, which we don't even know that much about, really, unless you like dive into literally every aspect of Doctor Who media. For stuff presented in the show, we don't know that much, but it upends a lot of it. And it doesn't really massively impact anything after that. Like, there's a little bit, tiny bit of an identity crisis thing at the end of that episode of The Timeless Children, and a little bit of that lingers in the following episode, which was Revolution of the Daleks. But in Flux, like, we see an appearance of Joe Martin's Doctor, but no real additional context. We get an acknowledgement of Tek Tayoun, who factored into the Timeless Child editions, but gets killed and doesn't really impact the immediate story. It just felt like lore dumps that I had always assumed were meant to be in service of something. I'd always assumed that this was set up for a story that he wanted to tell and needed to make these changes to tell it. But at this point, it really does seem like he did it for its own sake. And some of the things he said that really leads me to that conclusion include things like admitting he doesn't know where the Doctor comes from. This whole thing that he plants, that the Doctor is not actually from Gallifrey, but is from somewhere else, he doesn't know where. And that he has a opinion of where he thinks Joe Martin's fugitive Doctor falls in the Doctor's life, in the Doctor's timeline, but doesn't say what that is, basically intentionally leaving it up to interpretation. The idea that that's the goal, to just have this stuff there, but not to do anything with it, to introduce these very disruptive concepts. And the fugitive Doctor I was fairly prepared to roll with. These are very big disruptive contexts. You're introducing very different toys into the toy chest, and they just sit there. And maybe another creator will pick them up, maybe they won't. And Chibnall himself even acknowledged, yeah, somebody might undo this. Okay, but then if somebody does, what was the point? Because here's the thing. With retcons and how they work, yes, nearly anything you write in a long-running thing, whether it be Doctor Who or comic books or whatever, has the potential to be undone. The particular impact that you did to a character or their history or whatever status quo change you make can be undone and rolled back. But there's still something left when that happens. We still have whatever stories came about and could only have come about during the time when what you did was canon and was not retconned. So even if it is retconned in a way that the meaning changes, we still have those stories. What stories did you tell with these changes? And so if and when somebody decides to reverse it, which I've said before, I actually don't think anyone should bother. I think it should be treated the same way that Doctor Who treated the I'm half human on my mother's side thing from the Paul McGann TV movie, which is ignore it, move on, forget it happened. But if somebody does, then this truly becomes pointless because we don't even still have the stories that came out of it. It's really mind-boggling to me the way that he approached his work on Doctor Who. And I don't even think all of it was bad. I don't even think all of his scripts in specific are bad. But this is some J.J. Abrams nonsense. This idea of, ooh, it's big, it's disruptive, it's mysterious. What does it mean? I don't understand the headspace of any creative person who is going to approach work that way. There are clearly some who do, even some successful people. But like, I don't understand. I don't think I can ever understand. Because again, there's this thing, and I've seen it be said in my comments, and like even before Chibnall effectively confirmed it in this interview, people said, oh, you know, part of the reason for The Timeless Child was to bring the mystery back to the Doctor. Okay, on the one hand, I get that. That is an aspect of the Doctor that has kind of been lost over time. Because when Doctor Who was first introduced, we had no idea who this person was. We didn't find out that there were really even others of his species until several years into the show. We didn't get a name for Time Lords for several years after that. We didn't get a name for Gallifrey for years after that. Like, what little information we have has been drip-fed over a long time. And as that happens, as Gallifrey and Time Lords became demystified, which isn't the thing I think is good, but it's kind of the natural thing that's going to happen when something runs this long. And I actually think, while I kind of wish there was less demystification of Gallifrey than there has been, to try and undo that by suggesting that the Doctor isn't even from there, but having no intention to do anything more with that. The thing is, the loss of mystery of a character, while regrettable and something that like you'll miss over time, that's also the kind of thing you can't bring back without traumatic consequences, because mystery is the natural outcropping of not knowing much. And it's really hard to tell an interesting story over what's coming up on 60 years without ever revealing more about that character. The mystery is going to fade because there is story potential in giving some more information. People who hang around for as long as Doctor Who fans have do want to know some things. Not all of us want to know everything. I don't. But people want to know some things. The thing is, you can't just roll us back to 1963 where we have no idea who the Doctor is. Because that's not the normal now. That is what the normal was 60 years ago. That nobody knew who the Doctor was. But people's normal now, and for decades, has been, we don't know everything about the Doctor's life. We still don't know who the heck Susan's parents were. We don't know if, assuming Susan is actually the Doctor's granddaughter, we don't know if the Doctor had a son, a daughter, both, multiple children, who with? We don't know any. There's tons of stuff we do not know. But we're used to knowing a certain amount. And suddenly going, oh, no, you don't know anything. You don't get to just leave it like that, because the new normal, and I'm not talking about like narrative status quo, I'm talking the normal relationship between the audience and the Doctor for decades has been, we know somewhat, more or less, what your deal is. With still some huge sizable gaps, but we more or less kind of know your general deal. That's what people have as their relationship. And while some people probably do like having the mystery reignited, like, oh, now we don't know. Oh, it's all mysterious again. Like, that had no appeal to me. My core issue with the Timeless Child thing, if you don't remember, was the fact that it made the Doctor too important, cosmically speaking, because now the Time Lords only know how to regenerate because of the Doctor. And I've railed before about how I don't like the Doctor to be that important. I like the Doctor to be incredibly important to the people who encounter the Doctor, the people who the Doctor saves, not on a universal scale. It was part of my issue with Moffat's era as well, to be completely honest. So just to reiterate where my big issue with that whole thing came in. But while some people may go, oh, it's mysterious again, you can't be surprised that a very large chunk, if not a majority of the audience, goes, I don't know how to relate to this anymore. You now presented a huge hole. Are you going to fill it in with anything? And then are either angry or confused when you go, no, I like the hole. And look, as I said, I'm not somebody who needs answers to everything. I've got massive amounts of material in my own dang novel, tons of stuff that I know about the world, the characters, and the setting that's not in the book because it didn't impact the story. So, like, in terms of not laying out everything start to finish and not giving answers to everything, I get that. Lots of stuff gets over-explained, but there's a difference between over-explaining and literally no explanation whatsoever. If you're going to try and get away with not explaining it, what I do feel you have an obligation to do is to make it clear why it doesn't matter. If you want an example of this, I would point to something like Inception from Christopher Nolan. There was all this needless discourse about whether or not the top that's spinning at the end falls over or not to indicate whether or not he's still in a dream or if he's in the real world. And the thing that all of the people making their hot takes and their interpretations and their analysis and their endings explained videos about that failed to pick up, and it's in the text of the movie. If you're paying attention, the movie makes it clear we don't see whether or not it falls over because it doesn't matter if he's in the real world or not. What matters is he walked away from the top. He has decided that this is his reality. So it doesn't matter if it's the real world or not, or if it's still a dream. It's the reality he's chosen. So that's why we don't see whether or not the top falls over, because that's not the point. The point is he chose to leave it behind because this is what he's choosing to be his reality. So if you're going to present us with a lack of answers, at the very least, present us properly, thematically, with the reason why it doesn't actually have to be there, why we don't actually need the answers. And Chibnall tried to do this, but it is the weakest possible way to do it. Because in The Timeless Child, there's the whole interaction with Joe Martin in The Matrix that basically amounts to Joe Martin saying,
have you ever been limited by who you were before?
And the answer is no. And I agree, but if it doesn't change who she is, why is it here? Because effectively in that story, she's just taken out of it, stuck into a exposition machine, and she gets all this stuff dumped on her. She's not participating in the story, and then determines, oh, well, this doesn't matter anyway.
Now that does sound like me talking.
That's not telling us that we don't need an answer because this is the real point. That's literally telling us the thing you just spend a bunch of time with doesn't matter. I can almost kind of, if I squint, sort of see what Chibnall might have been trying to do. But the fact that he is expressing as much satisfaction with his work as he did in that interview is confounding to me. And I want to be clear, it's not like he didn't own up to any problems. He was very upfront about the fact that he thinks The Battle of Ranskorav-Kolos is by far the worst script that he ever wrote. And it's literally a first draft because he had to go back and help with rewrites and revisions on everybody else's script as kind of a consequence of the fact that a lot of the writers he brought in didn't have a background in sci-fi. So he had to help adjust their scripts to make it actually fully work for Doctor Who. But that meant he did not have time to properly revise that finale. And he's very upfront about that. So I don't want to make it seem like he's doing nothing but going, no, I'm happy. No, I'm great. No, it's awesome. He's not. He's acknowledging faults, but he doesn't seem to think any of this is anything other than exactly what he wanted to do, which, I mean, if the man got to do the stories he wanted for the most part, I can be happy for him in the abstract. It's nice when artists get to do what they wanted to do. I guess I just don't understand why this was what he wanted to do. And I also want to emphasize the fact that even my initial interpretation that at this point I don't stand by anymore, that Chibnall was scrambling, kind of responding to maybe not being happy with earlier series or responding to criticism, that's not automatically a bad thing, nor would he be the only one to do it. I think you can see that Moffat was kind of doing that as time went on. When the Doctor, Capaldi's Doctor especially, was viewed as maybe a bit too harsh and abrasive. He got silly and goofy and, forced cool in Series 9.
What's the matter with him? He's never like this.
Well, you really are new, aren't you?
And he flipped from one series being pretty much all self-contained to one series being mostly two-parters. But that felt less like a direct response to criticism of the show and more of him trying to keep himself invigorated with the project and sort of imposing new things like, ooh, what if we did it this way? That felt, and I mean, it's a feeling, that felt more like chasing creative energy than being a reaction. But some certain aspects of it, I'm sure, were direct reactions to how people felt about things they did or didn't like about his work up to that point. His stretch for Matt Smith through Peter Capaldi does feel like at various points it is reacting to, if not directly responding to, stuff that was going on in terms of the response to his work. How much it was, I'm sure he would argue very little, but I still feel like it's there at least a little bit. So I don't want to completely bash that as a concept. And sometimes you need the feedback to realize that what you thought was working isn't even landing with your intended audience. Because look, any creator can make something that is what they want and maybe it doesn't land with the audience. But if part of your goal was to create something crowd-pleasing, then yeah, maybe the feedback matters. Chibnall and Moffat before him seem to at least claim that they largely tried to not take in the criticism in the online discourse, which for their own mental health would have been the right thing to do. Absolutely. No question about that. So I'm not even going to say they should have waded into all that. Especially Chibnall, because holy crap, to quote James Stephanie Sterling,
the fan base is f***ing exhausting.
I get that, but I just keep coming back to, if the way that you approach this wasn't in some way a response or reaction to how people felt about your work, I just don't understand. Because it really does feel like The Timeless Child was set up at the very end of Series 12, touched on a little bit. I think a lot of us expected it to factor a fair bit in flux, and then when it didn't, we assume, well, it's gonna have to come up in the specials, right? Because it hasn't led to hardly anything. And to have that be all he planned, that all he ever planned to do to follow up was a little bit of a tiny sliver of an existential crisis briefly for the Doctor, reintroduce Tecteun, who does almost nothing, kill her, have the watch, plant it very much as a, ooh, we could bring this back later, and then not bring it back. I don't understand why. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes creators just make decisions that absolutely blow me away, and especially when I find out that they are happy that they did do what they intended, or that they didn't think something was going to go down the way it went down. I mean, to step outside Doctor Who for a minute, I'm still bowled over by the fact that the creators of WandaVision thought that casting Evan Peters as a fake version of Wanda's brother, Evan Peters, again, reminder, played kind of the same character, played Quicksilver in the Fox X-Men movies before Disney acquired Fox, and the version of Wanda's brother in the MCU was a completely different actor, and the character's been dead for a bit. It blew my mind finding out after the show was finished that the creators genuinely thought that putting Evan Peters in that part would be seen as just a fun Easter egg, and that people weren't going to think it meant more and read into it and then be deeply unhappy when it was nothing. Like, fans can have excessive expectations, and sometimes it's very unfair when fandoms get mad at creators, not for something they did, but something that the audience or the fans assumed they were going to do, but then didn't, but the creators themselves basically never promised. That is nonsense, and it does happen. I'm not immune from it. I've probably done it. But at the same time, how are you so unplugged, so unaware of what the fandom for your property is like, that you thought people would go, oh, that's cute, that's a fun Easter egg, it doesn't mean anything? How? And that's kind of a similar general feeling that I have to Chibnall. Like, okay, if this was what you wanted to do, how was it that you ever thought that this was going to go down well, though? And again, the amount of fan-pleasing you should or shouldn't do, that's a very debatable thing. Because, you know, there's arguments of how much freedom should a creator have to create their own thing versus what kind of ownership does the fandom have over a thing? And it gets complicated by something as old as Doctor Who, when, you know, some fans have, you know, could very well have been watching the show for longer than Chibnall has. He's been a fan since youth, so probably not as many, but like, theoretically, this isn't just his property to do whatever he wants with. And so that complicates things. Like, there's a lot of nuance and discussion to be had about that. So regardless of exactly where you feel on how much freedom a creator should be given on a long-running property like this, that's your own determination to make. But no matter what, I always assumed if he's doing this, it has to be for something, but it wasn't. This is so weird. It's just weird. This has been very rambly, and it's been much more about Chibnall's mindset, I guess, more than anything else, because that's just where I'm confused. It's so strange to me. And yet here we are. But again, I want to emphasize this has not been all bad. There are individual episodes that I've loved, and there are performances that I really like. There are even some of the new elements brought in, like Joe Martin's Fugitive Doctor, I would very much like more of, please. But when I try and parse just what he was doing, I can't. Even when it's basically laid out in front of me, I don't get it. And I feel that more than anything kind of sums up my feeling on Chibnall's era as a showrunner. I don't get it. And that doesn't even necessarily make a thing bad. But at the very least, I have to cop to the fact that whoever this was for, or however this is going to connect as a whole piece of work for people, it's for someone who isn't me. And that's okay. But usually, I can understand what was being tried for and who it was for. And this time, it's really hard. But again, if you liked it, great. I wish I did. And there are, again, individual parts I like. I liked how it ended. I liked Power of the Doctor. I'm kind of excited to watch that again. It was a thrill ride. It was wonderful. It was nostalgic. It just gave me good feelings all over. And I just wish it was a capper to a run of series that I understood better or at all. I suppose maybe as time goes on, I'll ultimately decide I was trying to read more into all of this than there ever was going to be with Chibnall, and maybe that's on me because I was used to Moffat for so long, and maybe that just put me in the wrong headspace to be able to digest what Chibnall was trying to do. Like, maybe with more distance, I'll look back on this and go, okay, like I needed to be in a completely different headspace and come at this from a completely different angle to have a better chance at getting it. Maybe not. But this is where I am right now. The end of Chibnall's era. What'd you think about that? What'd you think about any of the stuff I've said? In many ways, this is old news because I'm citing, a 6-month-old article, but like I've got new context for what he said now. I didn't really talk about this thing at the time, but now I've got full context for it now that his era's done. So this felt like the time to actually try and dive into it. But whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. I already plugged the Patreon. There's a link down in the description for that as well. Like, share, subscribe are also huge helps. But even if you can't help me out with any of that, I want you to remember that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You're the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. All right, time to thank my highest supporting patrons. Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Emu Delkey, Leotha Boyd, Toy Loli, Becky Sparks, Phrenobulax, The Poodle, Zach, Bookworm, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Shayla Gourlay, Brendan LaRose, and TT. Thank you for your support. If you want to hear me try and say your name while this little guy tries to chew on my earrings, well, you can check out the Patreon for the support tiers that get you a shout out. Thanks so much. You are a pain in my butt.